Hello and welcome. So today's video is going to be all about the disastrous marriage of King George IV. So George IV was the eldest child of King George III of Great Britain and Queen Charlotte. He was a playboy, he had loads of mistresses, he ate loads of food, drank loads of alcohol, he was addicted to laudanum, and his nickname was the Prince of Wales, as in the big sea mammal, and this was a play on the fact that he was the Prince of Wales as in the country, and they called him Wales as in the sea animal because he grew like really fat later in life. As well as this, George loved to gamble, so he ran up huge debts and he loved to spend loads on fancy clothes as well. So when George was around 21, he met Maria Fitzherbert and they married in secret. Now, Maria didn't actually really want to marry George, and he ended up emotionally manipulating her into marrying him by saying that he would kill himself if she didn't, and he did actually stab himself, but in a safe way, to prove that this is something that he would do so that she would marry him. And after this, she did actually agree to marry him. Now, George and Maria's marriage had to remain a secret because, one, he did not get permission off the monarch to be able to marry her, and two, Maria was Catholic and she wasn't prepared to convert over to being a Protestant, and this meant that if the marriage was recognised publicly, George would have been barred from inheriting the throne under the 1701 Act of Settlement, which basically said that a Catholic cannot inherit the British throne, nor could you marry someone who was Catholic and inherit the British throne. He went to his father, George III, and asked if he would bail him out of all this debt, and his father agreed to, but only if George married his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. Now remember, no one knew that George had already married Maria, and George couldn't exactly come out and say, I can't marry Caroline, I'm already married to Maria. And plus, he really wanted to become king eventually, and he really wanted his debts paid, so George agreed to marry Caroline. So Caroline was sent for, she came over to Britain, she and George met for the first time, and it did not go well. Caroline declared that George was much fatter than his portrait and also not as handsome, while George said that Caroline really smelled and he had to have a brandy to calm his nerves. The wedding, of course, still had to go ahead, and George was just not happy about this. On his wedding day, George was incredibly drunk and he basically had to be dragged down the aisle to the altar. While at the altar, he cried through the veils and then tried to crawl away to get away. In the evening, once they had both gone into their bed chamber to consummate the marriage, George ended up passing out in an empty fire grate before they could do anything. But they did actually manage to have sex though, because around 9 months after they got married, Caroline gave birth to a daughter who they named Charlotte. So after the birth of Charlotte, George and Caroline did not share a bed again. In fact, they basically effectively separated from each other. George really hated Caroline, but the public actually really liked her. They really did not like George, and they saw Caroline as this victim of this really horrible man who just wanted to get drunk and sleep with women. Now, Caroline was also a really great hostess, and she would actually host people who were George's enemies, which George did not like. George actually became convinced that Caroline was sleeping with these men who were his enemies that she was entertaining, and he actually started trying to discredit her by spreading around that she had had an illegitimate child by one of his enemies. Now, Caroline was actually looking after this baby boy, and George used this as evidence to say that yes, she has had an illegitimate child, and there was an investigation into this. And it was actually found out that this boy was the son of a destitute family, and Caroline had actually offered to take this boy into her home and raise him. The parents of this boy actually turned up at the investigation to prove that this was actually true. Now, this actually did nothing to stop the people liking Caroline. They saw her as being like really charitable and kind now, but they did hate George even more. And George got really angry that his plot to basically discredit Caroline had absolutely failed. So he restricted Caroline's access to their daughter Charlotte and also had people spy on her. So being absolutely fed up with being spied on, Caroline left Britain for mainland Europe, where she had an absolutely amazing time. While over there, she met a former soldier who she made her chamberlain, but rumours did start going around that this chamberlain was also her lover. So George became really mad that Caroline was having such a good time on the continent, and he became really vindictive towards her. He didn't even tell her when their daughter Charlotte died during childbirth. Caroline found out by accident when a messenger on the way to deliver this news to the Pope ended up stopping at the place where she was staying. George really wanted to be able to divorce Caroline because he really didn't want to be married to her anymore. So even though she was in Rome at this time, he sent spies over there to spy on her to see if they could find any evidence of adultery on her part. Now, these spies literally reported back everything. One of the things they even reported back was how much wee was in the chamber pot from the bedroom in the morning, as this would be able to let you know how many people were sleeping in that room. So after George's spies had collected all this evidence, George went to Parliament and asked them for a divorce. But then George's father, King George III, died and George became King George IV. And now he was even more determined to divorce Caroline so that she would not become queen. Or she was actually technically queen once he became king, so that she would not be crowned queen. Now, Parliament did offer Caroline a generous payout to stay in mainland Europe and never come back to Britain again. But Caroline refused this because she was determined to come back and face the House of Lords and effectively become queen. So Caroline came back to Britain and she was greeted with a hero's welcome. Now, when Caroline arrived back in Britain, she was met with this bill called the Pain and Penalties Bill, which allowed her to be put on trial for adultery. So at the trial for the bill, Caroline was defended brilliantly by her counsel. And the public absolutely loved all the scandal that was being thrown around. So the bill did pass through the House of Commons by the tiniest of margins, but the people weren't happy about this and things started to get a bit tense. So the Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, declared that the bill would not progress further into the House of Lords. So that basically meant that it was over. The bill could not be put into law or anything like that. So George and Caroline were still married, and that meant that Caroline could be crowned queen when George was crowned king. On the day of George's coronation, Caroline turned up at Westminster Abbey, but she was not allowed in. The door was basically shut in her face. But Caroline was determined to be crowned queen, so she went to literally every other single door at Westminster Abbey, but all of them were still just shut in her face and like not open to her at all. But this time the people were not on her side. They had turned up to see the coronation of their new king. They had turned up to see all the splendour of it, to have a good time, to have a party. They really did not want to have to deal with any more of Caroline's drama. Now, this incident outside Westminster Abbey really humiliated Caroline. So she went to stay at Brandenburg House, where she sadly ended up passing away a few weeks later. George ended up dying 10 years after his wife. So that was a little video about the disastrous marriage of King George IV. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.